Welcome to Vanderheist and the Out on a Limb podcast. Today, as promised, we are talking about pollination. Now, what is pollination? It's simply a fancy word for a way that plants will spread and combine an egg and a sperm, or an egg and pollen, as many of us see it floating around this time of year. Pollination, however, is important to almost everything that we do when it comes to food and the life that we are used to. For example, without pollinators, there'd be no apples, there'd be no cherries. Without pollinators, many of the fruits and vegetables that we like simply would not be available, or it would have to be up to man to make that cross between the male and the female plants. Now, Mother Nature, though, has made this quite easy. And by proper choosing of plants, many of the plants you see around me right now, you can have your own pollinator garden to help in the survival of pollinators. As we all know, over the last year, bees have been in decline, and we really do need to help in expanding our plantings and our designs to help pollinators survive. Let's just look at a couple of specific things here that I have around me right now. This is a trumpet honeysuckle. It is a vining plant. Blooms usually towards late June and into July. And what attracts this for many pollinators are these long tubular flowers. They're beautiful for us to see as well, but pollinators such as hummingbirds and butterflies look for plants with these long tubes so that they can stick their tongues into them and bring out the nectar. There are other plants that simply are known as great plants for bugs and insects. This white one in front of me here is called a butterfly bush, and you bet it brings butterflies into the yard. Then we have something next to me here by the name of bee balm, and this is a very specific attractant to bees. Now, you do have to remember in a design when you're trying to bring bees into a landscape that if you have people who are highly allergic to bees, this may not be the right plant for you. But simply by choosing plants, whether they're native or not, you can attract various materials into the landscape. Now, this is a cultivated bee balm, so it looks extremely pretty, works well in your landscape, but you can also use native forms of plants, such as this native bee balm or this native columbine that would fit a natural garden more, but also bring pollinators in. So set a goal for yourself to choose various plants that you see in front of me and create a pollinator garden, or add a few plants that you can bring our pollinators into your area.
Okay, Tom, we've had some questions from our friends in Northeast Wisconsin and our customers. I'd like to throw those at you and see if you can help us out with some information on that. When we're talking about pollinators and gardens for pollinators, what type of light requirements are we looking for?
Well, in most cases, the plants that we're talking about today especially love full sun. So in general, you want to find a space that gets 4 to 6 hours of direct sun for your garden. But we're also standing in an area here of plants that can do with a little bit less, maybe 4 hours of sun. So it's not going to be heavy shade, but you're going to need some amount of light, let's say between 4 and 6 hours.
So you can add a pollinator garden to just about any portion of your landscape.
Oh, absolutely. This could be a small area that's tucked in among shrubs, could be added to your vegetable garden, could be part of your flower garden. And if you're struggling with where to put it, companies like us, Vanderheist, offers design services that we can help you find the best location. Bring in some pictures of your yard, and we'll find the best place for your pollinator garden.
It's true. Now, we're also into July now, so do we have to worry about timing and when we plant these?
Spring is always best, but as long as you are talking about plants that are already in the pot, or above ground as shrubs would be here in the nursery, they can be planted any time of year. You just have to remember to keep them watered. So given the fact that we're in the middle of summer, you don't plant your pollinator garden and take a 2-week cruise. You help take care of it, and if you are busy through the summer, you can plant right up into November.
And like Tom said, if you have any questions, give us a call or stop in and see us. Now we're going to step into the studio and talk a little bit more about pollinators and pollinator gardens. Thanks for joining us again. Welcome to the Out on a Limb podcast. My name's Todd Trueblood. With me today is Tom Jensen, an industry expert in the landscape world. And we're going to talk a little bit about pollination, pollinators, and the plants that they love.
That's correct.
Okay, so Tom, tell me what pollination means to you.
Pollination is simply a process that brings the egg and sperm of various plants together so that they can produce a new generation. That could be by producing the plant itself. It could be by producing a seed. It could be by producing something we're used to eating, like an apple. Which helps hold the seed and then ultimately allows it to grow into a new tree.
Sure. And why is that all that important?
Well, with all the things we just talked about, there would be no apples, for example, if we didn't have pollination. We wouldn't have that food source. Same goes for other crops. You need pollination to have corn on the cob so that the corn is produced. So we're talking just about anything that affects us when it comes to food comes from pollination. I mean, there are ways now that there are ways to produce fruit without pollination, but we're talking with man's interference. If you're talking naturally, there has to be something allowing egg and sperm to come together to make it work. Same for our shade trees, same for the plants you're putting out in your landscape, same for your grass, all the things you see outside your window. If we wouldn't have that pollination happening, it wouldn't be there.
Yeah, I think it's important to every being on Earth, not only creating habitat for our pollinator friends, the bees and the butterflies and our little guys like that, but also, like you said, creating a food source for humans, shade source to keep your house cool through the summer and warm through the winter, or whatever your landscape is doing for you. It's very important to all of us.
Well, it is, and we have forgotten about that because, ask somebody where an apple comes from, a little kid, he says, from the store.
Right. Yep.
They have no concept of what is happening before the product reaches their table. They don't even think about it. And with the way the environment is changing, or we treat the environment, we're putting many of these pollinators or the process of pollination at risk nowadays.
I took steps recently to change that too. I've learned all of that from my grandfather. This is where an apple comes from. This is where a raspberry comes from. And I had kind of neglected that for quite a while. You get busy, things happen, kids are in high school and soccer and all that good stuff. So I started thinking about my grandkids coming along, and so I've planted an apple tree, I've planted a serviceberry, I've got some raspberries, looking at some blueberries that I don't like them as much as my wife does, but all that is important, and all that is going to need our friends that are the pollinators.
Absolutely.
So what do we do for those pollinators?
Well, there's many different ways of looking at it. First thing, you need to know what is pollinating the plants that you are talking about. You kind of alluded to the little critters going along the ground that can do it. But pollination can happen by wind. Mm-hmm. Corn is wind pollinated, so we don't need insects to technically get an ear of corn. But we have then things like apples, which are pollinated specifically by bees. So if we did not have bees in that area, there would be no apples that year. There are plants that are pollinated by bats, not in our area, but certainly in the tropical rainforest.
Sure, yep.
There are plants that are pollinated by flies. There are plants actually that man still pollinates to make better and better fruits. So there are set insects, people, conditions that have to be met. So if you're trying to help this pollination happen, you have to provide those requirements or make sure nothing is happening to them.
Right, and one of the things that we do quite a bit is plant plants that pollinators love. We shoot for that anyway, and that goes back to my preference, I guess, for native plants. There's a lot of native plants that pollinators, butterflies, bees especially,
hummingbirds, they love a lot of our native plants. So we provide a habitat for those beings, the butterflies and the bees, to spend time in and feed on. What else do they need besides
Well,
the habitat?
there's things on the outside world, and I'm going to use bees because everybody sees them, but bees are very sensitive to pesticides. Now, so you might be spraying a tree or a shrub next door to an orchard, let's say, and in the process of what you're doing through your pesticide application, you're actually killing the bees that are coming to the tree.
Yep.
It's one of the reasons specific to an apple is that there's a rule there that you just stop spraying your trees while the tree is in blossom. And you don't put any chemical near it until the blossoms have dropped.
Right.
That's because the bees are there. So you could be doing it yourself by spraying an orchard spray, which is a mix of different chemicals, trying to help the tree out, but you've just killed the bees.
Right.
Butterflies are big pollinators, and they need plants just with the way they take in food, the butterfly itself, that are long trumpet-shaped flowers. Lantanas, garden salvias, just to list a few, are plants that they're looking for. So if, again, you don't have the right plant for a butterfly to draw nectar from, you're not going to have the butterflies. Also, butterflies have a very unique life cycle where they have larvae, they have caterpillars. And the monarch butterfly, for example, is very specific in that caterpillar lives on the foliage of milkweed. Now, nobody wants milkweed in their yard. That's your native plant. That's your weed issue.
Yep.
But without milkweed for that caterpillar to eat, they won't go into a cocoon, and there won't be another history of butterflies.
Yep.
So you also have to, if you talk about a butterfly garden, you're going to be planting things that may not be pretty, and you are planting things that are going to be eaten. And that goes against everything we do with gardening nowadays. We
Right.
don't want a bug, we don't want a speck on our leaves. Well, you're going to have chopped leaves, and you're going to have other things happening to get those butterflies.
There's more and more things like that too that are probably a little away from what we're used to doing. We're used to planting things, and hopefully nothing eats them. They're in good shape all the time. They look great. Butterfly gardening being one of those. We want to plant some things that the larva is going to chomp on.
Right.
We also need to set up some sort of a water source at that point so
Sure.
that the butterfly and the larva have access to that as well, and some protection. It's not a bad idea to have an evergreen tree near your butterfly
Exactly.
garden so that the butterflies have some space to get away from predators and get away from the sun, things like that.
Well, and with butterflies, it's not a bird bath. They like
Right.
little
Nope.
puddles of water, things
Wet sand.
wet sand,
Yep.
bubbling water over a rock where water gets into the crevices. So yeah, you're thinking out of the box all the way through to their particular life cycle.
And it's a wonderful thing to do. It's a little different from a lot of gardening tactics, but it's a great thing to do because it adds something that you don't see very often. We've had really nice luck over the last 2 years to have a pretty good pretty good troop of hummingbirds that
Yes.
have come into our yard, and it's so cool. And when the kids are around, and the hummingbird is just kind of flittering around their heads, and it's something you just don't see every day.
Well, and that's a way to get kids involved.
Right.
And again, you're right, even this year, the hummingbirds are all over. I mean, they're already in our yard.
Right.
But hummingbirds, just to go back to something I said before, feed just like butterflies. First of all, red is what they see, but you also have to remember that they see red and they see infrared and ultraviolet. So what we see as red may not be red to a hummingbird. And they like the long tubular flowers once again.
Yep.
So even if you're in an apartment building, and I had mentioned lantana before as a plant, they are a huge attractant to butterflies. Instead of putting a geranium out as a hanging basket, you could buy something like lantana, and now you have put something out that is a well-known source of food for butterflies and also for hummingbirds.
Great segues, like we planned it. So let's talk more about plants that we can plant for our pollinator friends, and what types of plants do you think? What's your favorite?
Well,
what's your favorite pollinator plant?
I don't look at natives, I'm afraid, because of that. That's one of where we differ. You're always on the native side of the coin, and I tend to be more on the cultivated side of the coin. I'm just going to mention butterflies with it and tell a little story, but Liatris is just a gay feather, or many different names, is just fabulous. And I was going through on a tour at Prairie Nursery down in the Madison area, I think it is, or Westfield area. And they had a 30, 40-foot row of Liatris in full bloom, and there may have been 200 butterflies there.
Right.
It's that much of an attractant. And you would walk up to it, and literally they would just flutter away and then come right back in. There are plants that I like that are named specifically for drawing plants in, such as bee balm or monarda. Sedums are, and it's more like the autumn joy, bring in bees like crazy. But I've got to say, if you're talking about this, you don't want these plants if there's a bee allergy in your family.
True, correct.
You may be helping out the pollinators, but don't put your family or someone at risk with having them close to the patio.
Right.
So what is yours?
Well,
it's going to be native.
It is going to be native, but what you said there, Liatris and what was the other one?
Butterfly, monarda. Bee
Monarda, both native.
Yes.
Native to Wisconsin, hardy plants. Might be a different cultivated variety, but Blazing Star, Monarda, the bee balms.
Lavender,
Yep.
because of the flower shape, once again, will do it. I've mentioned it a number of times here, but lantana as a seasonal plant that you're bringing in, maybe one of the best is annual salvia.
Yeah.
Again, it just attracts, in this case, butterflies and hummingbirds from everywhere.
I like butterfly weed, Asclepias.
Yep. That's also a food source. They also eat the leaves.
Yep, and probably one of the best orange flowers, period.
Exactly.
It's native to Wisconsin. It's tougher
Sure.
than heck.
And you can always, if you don't have plants, there are hummingbird feeders, going back to that. The other day in my yard, I saw an oriole even feeding from a hummingbird feeder, and butterflies will feed from it as well. So again, that range of materials is great. For bees, which are one of our biggest pollinator, you simply need flowers. They're going to come around and be searching, and they get their pattern, and they'll come back day after day after day. That's why, as we talked about with the apple tree, spraying is, you got to be careful.
Yeah.
Spray early in the morning, spray late at night, partially because the insects have bedded down for the night and they're not out and about feeding. Going out at 2 in the afternoon and dosing something with an insecticide is right at peak feeding time for many of the pollinators.
There's different reasons for pollinators to be attracted to a space. Some of them like the color, some of them like the fragrance, some of them like the texture, or the cover, or whatever it might be. So I think a nice blended garden, whether it's a hummingbird garden or a butterfly garden or whatever it might be, with a number of different plants, gives you options as to what pollinators are going to be attracting.
Oh, certainly, and everybody thinks this is going to look like a meadow next door.
Right.
This can be done in a way that is just as formal as an English perennial border or the American mixed border, where we have trees, shrubs, and annuals all together in the same place. It doesn't have to have a negative connotation from a design aspect.
Right. It's definitely something. I used to have it. The place I lived previously had a great cluster of cardinal flower, which is a bright red, nice color, lobelia. But even though most people think of lobelia as purple, this is a bright red flower, and it's a cluster of those, and cultivated to look like a clump, but it was still part of an attraction for pollinators. So you can do some really nice things. You might have to work a little harder. You might have to think a little more, but you can do some really nice things with native
and it
plants.
really should be planned out. You mentioned cardinal flower likes a wet soil.
Right.
It's not going to live in a heavy, dry soil. It likes it moist.
Right.
So you have to know that and put them in that situation. Milkweed, again, even though it's not thought of as a yard plant, is a key one for so many of the pollinators. So where is that going to work specifically? Draw it out. Get help from someone. Stop in at Vanderheis and say, hey, I'm trying to design this. Talk with our perennial expert, especially Bev.
Yep.
And I'm sure she can, in a few minutes, at least give you 4 or 5 plants that would work in that area and give you a chance to at least begin bringing these these bugs and other things in.
I haven't told you yet, but we're going to enlist you to help us with a seminar we're doing with the do-it-yourself design seminar where we can design up a perennial garden for people. We'll be doing that in July.
I'll be out of town.
I have control of your calendar, so I'll take a look at that. So, thanks for coming, Tom.
Anytime. It's always
been
a
great
pleasure.
always great talking about plants. Always great talking about our bees and butterfly friends.
I was nervous about this one. I had butterflies in my stomach.
Oh man! Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.